This is Mike Brady, co-team lead. I'll just remind everyone, for those that are familiar with these calls, we pack a lot in 1 hour. So for the sake of time, we do want to try to get some time at the end for discussion. So we'll ask that if you have specific questions about the presentation, so just plug them into the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that and try to weave that into the discussion at the end. We will try to get through presentations quickly and then hold all questions to the end verbally. And I also want to point you to the questions at the end of the agenda. We're going to try to gravitate towards those during discussion. For those on the phone, we'll verbalize those with time permitting at the end. So welcome everyone. I'm Mike Brady. I'm the IARPC data team co-lead, and I'm a cartographer with the Department of Defense. First, thanks to Ann and Jonathan. Jonathan Blythe is co-team lead for the IARPC data team. Thanks so much for collaborating to put this call together. And also thanks to Colleen Strawhacker at NSF Polar Programs for agreeing to provide opening remarks, which we'll turn to after I provide a brief overview of the agenda. As a reminder, the structure of IARPC collaborations, the data team is a sub-team of the environmental intelligence collaboration team. And it does look like we have representation from that team on this call today, which is good. So these calls, because we're a sub-team of the environmental intelligence team, we tend to gravitate toward use-inspired science perspectives for science, for policy and decision support. As such, we provide a platform for practitioner scientist co-production methods for enhancing Arctic data access and usability. A lot going on there, but we try to unpack it as we kind of get to discussions and keep it as a theme, running theme throughout these calls. So the two presentations today address Arctic data access and usability through efforts to enhance the design of data repositories, and data-driven information and knowledge products that focus on how they are or will be used. So it's that use-inspired perspective of data repositories and product design. For today's discussion, we invited two presentations that span the spectrum of basic applied data uses and users to be inclusive of scientific and action research perspectives. The first presentation by Erin McLean will touch on efforts to expand and improve the NSF's Arctic Data Center, their stewardship of social science data in particular. And Dr. Nancy Fresco will follow with a presentation on efforts by the Scenarios Network for Alaska and Arctic Planning, or SNAP tool, design of climate data and tools to meet local community needs. So as I mentioned before, we're going to get through these presentations fairly rapidly to hold some time for discussion at the end. So any specific questions, please plug right into that chat box. Now we invited Colleen to kick the presentations off to share her perspectives on contextualizing Arctic social science data. So that said, I'll hand it over to you, Colleen. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks Mike. Hi everyone. I think I actually know most of you, but for those of you who don't know me, I am Colleen Strawhacker. I'm a program officer in the Arctic Sciences section at the National Science Foundation, and on leave as at my position as a research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, where I spent 5 years working on these issues, and I love talking about social science data, so I'm looking forward to geeking out with you all for the next hour or so. So I just wanted to provide a couple of thoughts that I've been tossing around in my head for the past almost decade now about some of these efforts. And, obviously there has been a lot of effort put into managing data from the natural sciences and the geosciences. We have seen a lot of really good investment and effort put into managing Indigenous knowledge and approaches to Indigenous data sovereignty. Those include my work on the ALOCA program, as many of you know, and efforts by Indigenous scholars and new and emerging networks to talk about these issues on Indigenous data sovereignty and making sure that those kind of data sets and knowledge sets are appropriately managed and archived. These have emerged into the new CARE principles. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the FAIR principles, the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And Indigenous data sovereignty networks have come up with the new CARE principles, which are collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility and ethics. Responsibility and ethics, that's the last E. So it's been really great to see a lot of thought and theorizing around Indigenous knowledge, but I think where we haven't done a lot of that social science data yet. We know that there is a lot of overlap between social science data and Indigenous knowledge, given that many social scientists work closely with Indigenous peoples, but that they're two different things. And much of this has been ignored, not just in the Arctic context, but I think globally too. Fortunately, I know, Erin, you'll talk about the Arctic Data Center, and the Arctic Data Center has had advisory committee members to talk about these issues, so it's great that the Arctic Data Center is making these efforts. The International Arctic Science Committee, or IASC, in their data management statement from 2013 refers to ethically open access data, which I really like that term because it kind of helps to contextualize the open access movement with some of the complexities around both Indigenous knowledge and social science data. But I think the main point that I wanted to make is that Indigenous knowledge and social science data are different. They're different beasts, and I think they're often lumped together. And I think we need to talk about them really differently. They both have different requirements. And so I just, social science data is complex. Social scientists create an incredibly diverse amounts of data and types of data, from GIS data, from interviews, from photographs, to complex data sets. This makes it nearly impossible to figure out, meaningful ways to curate them and discover them in a universal way. So I think we need to think about that really deeply. Not all social science is the same, and we can't all be lumped together. Research, and then there's this issue about research subjects and confidentiality. PIs often, and scientists, spend a lot of time building those relationships, which makes it difficult to think about those data sets. Research subjects also often talk about really sensitive topics, like sexual health, like politically sensitive topics. Often I've heard from scientists that they're afraid that if data are released, their research subjects could be in danger. These are very important contexts to consider. And I have never been convinced that we are able to adequately anonymize data in the Arctic, given how small a lot of the rural villages are and how well connected people are. So I think we need to think carefully about that. So I'll just leave my comments at that, just some high level things that I've been thinking about, and I'm really looking forward to the two presentations today and the conversation that follows. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to chat with you all about it.
Thanks so much, Colleen, and I hope you get to stay on for the discussion that happens at the end. So we're going to shift now to Erin McLean's presentation on, I guess, a post-brief of the April workshop at the Arctic Data Center on reuse of social science data. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Erin.
Sorry. There we go. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome. Excellent. So yeah, I'm Erin McLean. For those who haven't met me yet, I've met many of you on the call, at least virtually. And I'm the Community Engagement and Outreach Coordinator for the Arctic Data Center. So I'm going to, as Mike said, give a quick recap of the results, or at least what happened in the workshop that we held on supporting social science data, which was back in April. And I also want to echo one of Colleen's comments that really resonated with me. Indigenous knowledge and social scientific data, they can't necessarily be lumped together. And we recognize that as well at the Arctic Data Center. And the scope of the workshop that we held was meant to focus more on the social scientific data side than the Indigenous knowledge side. So it's not that we don't think that issue is important. We think that it deserves an entire separate discussion than what we did. So when you don't see it as much represented here in this presentation, that's why. Oh, there we go. So just as a quick introduction, I'm sure many of you know, but the Arctic Data Center is the primary data and software repository of the Arctic session of the Office of Polar Programs. Data preservation and discovery is really at the core of our mission, and we're committed to making sure that our data is discoverable and reusable by researchers from all disciplines. And not only do we have raw data sets in our catalog, but we also encourage researchers to upload software, code, and packages, as well as different provenance of data products. And since our start in 2016, we've grown substantially, and researchers now have access to over 52 terabytes of data. And in the last year alone, we've seen a 16% growth in data set count and a 30% growth in data volume. And all of that has come from advances in tools, both our tools at the Arctic Data Center, but also those in the scientific community, as well as an increasingly preservation-oriented culture among researchers and, of course, at the NSF. And we're planning to add more storage capacity in the coming months and hopefully the coming years as well. Researchers are coming to us with data sets in the terabytes. So we're excited to see this graph go even more off the y-axis in the near future. So what's in that 52 terabytes of data? And as it stands right now, these are our metrics. So we have almost 6,000 data sets individually that you can take a look at, you can download, you can reuse with appropriate attribution, all that jazz. And so the data that we have in our collection is added to or updated almost every day due to the requirements of submission. So projects that have to submit their data include all Arctic research opportunities through polar programs, and that data has to be uploaded within 2 years of collection. The Arctic Observing Network, AON, has a shorter timeline. Their data products have to be uploaded within 6 months of collection. And mandating the archiving of data is working well for those two different program classes. And as you can see in this chart, the data that we have comes from a wide variety of Arctic programs. However, almost all of these programs listed on this chart have a natural sciences focus, of course, with the notable exception of the Arctic Social Sciences program. And you can see that these social scientific data sets are vastly in the minority compared to the natural science data sets that we have. And, you know, we've seen this figure, and looking at it prompted us at the Arctic Data Center to ask ourselves, you know, why? Why is it like this? It's not that social scientific data isn't being produced, it's just not being archived. And so projects that are funded under the social sciences program have to submit their data as well to a long-lived archive, much like their natural science counterparts. So like, it's not a lack of policy that leads to this lack of social scientific research being available for synthesis projects, for download, for reuse, all of that. And with many social scientific disciplines, as Colleen brought up, there are of course exceptions for sensitive data like that human subjects data or locations of cultural sites, and anonymizing data can present an issue with smaller populations. But researchers are still asked to submit non-sensitive aspects of the project in the metadata. And so in theory, we should see the social sciences represented more, at least on the data set level, right? Not quite. And as you can see, the top themes that we have represented in our catalog by number of data sets are natural sciences focused. We have very few social scientific data sets in comparison. And as you can see, fields like political science, economics, archaeology, management, all of those are towards the bottom of this graph. Some of them with only single or double or triple data sets. And it's important to us to increase the number of social scientific data sets in our catalog. And we haven't had a lot of success doing so far. And so to that end, we decided to host a workshop bringing together Arctic social scientists from a variety of disciplines to brainstorm ways to increase Arctic social sciences representation in the data repository landscape. And so we had 3 goals of the workshop. The first was to reinforce partnership and communication. The second, to enhance understanding of how the Arctic Data Center can support the needs of the social scientific community. And the third was to outline further steps for both collaboration and training. And to accomplish those goals, we needed some social scientists. I saw that both of them are on the call, Nora Johnson from the National Snow and Ice Data Center, as well as Timothy Pash from the University of North Dakota. They both jumped in, both feet forward to help us plan and facilitate the workshop. And with their input, we identified a participant list of 21 Arctic social scientists, qualitative data specialists, and of course, NSF representatives from different disciplines. Of course, we had initially planned to have everyone join us here in Santa Barbara at NC's. Coronavirus threw a wrench into that, so we transitioned to an online model using Zoom. We met both in plenary and in breakout groups. And one of our breakout groups focused on the challenges that different disciplines are facing, and the other focused on suggestions to meet those challenges, brainstorming solutions. So I'll start by talking about the challenges identified. And to create some imagery rather than just a laundry list of challenges, I pasted the challenges section of the draft report that I wrote into a word cloud generator. After removing stop words and grouping some similar words, this is the word cloud that I'm looking at, which I think does a good job in conveying the diversity of the challenges faced by social science researchers. Largely, the roadblocks are broken up into three main categories. We've got one focused on education and training, and that was the focus of breakout group 1. The second focused on sensitive data and the culture of data sharing in the social sciences. That was breakout group 2. And also, of course, technical and infrastructure capabilities, which was the focus of breakout group 3. So first, let's take a look at the challenges in the realm of education and training. A theme that came up over and over again in this group's discussions was the lack of data management and wrangling training for social scientists. Many researchers and the social scientists just aren't exposed to training on what constitutes metadata, how to make a data management plan, or how to archive data. And what training does exist largely uses natural sciences examples rather than social scientific examples. To compound the problem, the lessons from a natural sciences focused training may not always transfer over. As Colleen mentioned, qualitative data is largely unstructured. There's a lot of different file formats. There's a large diversity there. And, natural sciences researchers are a lot used to work with that tabular data. And finally, open source data isn't as widely used in the social sciences as in the natural sciences. And so reproducible workflows, if they exist at all for the social sciences, aren't used as often as they are in the natural sciences. Next, let's take a look at the challenges associated with sensitive data as well as the culture of data sharing in the social sciences. These challenges were a bit more nebulous to pin down. Top of mind for many of our researchers, as Colleen mentioned, was their concern for the privacy of their sensitive data, including that human subjects data or cultural site data. Data in the social sciences often needs to be protected, as it should be. And then there are several different levels of sensitivity. There's, everything from that sexual health data to population data that is a little bit less sensitive. So there's really a big continuum there. Plus, social science researchers are bound to IRB approval, which can make sharing data to an archive difficult for open downloading. There are also points brought up about consent, and sometimes it's difficult to obtain consent either in the study or after the study has been concluded. And sometimes Indigenous populations are reluctant or opposed to data sharing due to past cases of inappropriate usage. It kind of comes down to a lack of trust in researchers between them and the peoples that they study, but also that lack of trust exists among the researchers themselves too. There may not be trust in the archive to protect the data, or there may not be that trust in another researcher to appropriately use that sensitive data. Above all else, social scientists have a big concern for protecting their research subjects, which is absolutely a valuable thing and something that repositories have to take into account when brainstorming solutions. And finally, let's take a look at the challenges on the technical and infrastructure side. And this is where the issue of unstructured data comes back in. There's many different file types associated with social scientific data, whether it's transcripts, audio files, scanned documents, aerial photos, what have you. And having that large diversity makes it difficult for centralized repositories to focus on social scientific data in the same way that other repositories can focus on a specific domain. There also aren't consistent vocabularies that have been developed to make these data more findable. Colleen mentioned the FAIR principles, and that can be a roadblock as well. The metadata support may not be there for qualitative data either, in the same way that, for example, EML, ecological metadata language, encapsulates natural sciences metadata. And also brought up was data rescue. Researchers in the Arctic are retiring, taking their data with them, which is leading to a huge loss in data. And largely all three of those areas, education and training, infrastructure, culture, All of those could apply to a researcher working in the tropics as well as the Arctic, but we also did articulate some uniquely Arctic challenges. Working with small populations and indigenous communities came up in conversation a lot, as well as international collaboration in the Pan-Arctic space. And climate change, too, is presenting a unique problem since the changes in the Arctic are happening more rapidly than in other places. So now we have all these challenges. How can we meet them? What can we do to make the landscape of Arctic social sciences more fair? And that was the focus of the second breakout session, which had our three groups: education, sensitive data, as well as technical and infrastructural capabilities. So from the education and training group, it seems like a low-hanging fruit, right? Social scientists aren't getting the training that they need, so let's make a training. And the Arctic Data Center is working on altering our current curriculum, which we offer for all Arctic scientists, to be more catered to a social scientific researcher. Other organizations may take up this mantle as well, and hopefully we can build on each other to give social scientists that robust data training that they really do need. Changing the culture of many disciplines, though, that's going to be a much larger problem, and that's going to require a lot of different approaches. An easy one is to have folks involved in data science and repositories like me, like other folks at the Arctic Data Center, like folks at IARC or the Arctic Data Committee, go to conferences with social scientific researchers. We should meet people where they are. Another suggestion was made to focus on having social scientists submit their metadata. And that's not necessarily a common practice right now, but the metadata doesn't run into those same concerns about sensitive data since they're not sharing the data, they're just sharing the data about the data. Yet another suggestion was to write a white paper similar to the one listed on the slide, Hampton et al. From 2015, which focuses on the skills and knowledge needed for data-intensive researchers research in the environmental scientists, but make it all about social sciences. And if there's wide co-authorship, that would hopefully increase community buy-in. Two other suggestions focused on the NSF's role. One suggestion was to enforce already existing requirements for data archival with the metadata and concerns about the sensitive data, as well as maybe to create a solicitation totally around data reuse. A final suggestion was to have data scientists and social scientists develop a set of best practices for different data types. For example, every time a social scientist creates a survey, she has to again think about how to anonymize the data. Whereas if a set of best practices existed, that mental work may already be done for her. So it would be a little bit easier to create that reproducible workflow. The technical side has more concrete steps that can be taken to advance social scientific data reuse, but none of them are easily done or confined to just one organization. One suggestion was for repositories and software companies to offer support or develop tools that work with social scientific data in a more open source fashion. Currently, the technical programs that exist are not open source, which can hinder reproducible research. Another suggestion focused on metadata submission, creating that best practices or a list of well-structured and complete examples. A further suggestion was for social scientists and data repositories to work together to develop that consistent and shared vocabulary to increase that interoperability so that all this data is able to talk to each other and is easily findable. And finally, with respect to the large amounts of data that exist in either an analog or an unarchived form, processes should be automated for data rescue efforts to ensure that data survival into the future. And many of the suggestions put forth in the workshop are cross-cutting across the breakout groups and across disciplines. All 5 of the suggestions on this slide, especially the first one, to encourage published data sites to be viewed as research products in their own right, should be acted on by social scientists and natural scientists alike to make data more fair. And so with that, I'll end this talk. Any questions I'll answer in the chat. Feel free to email me, engage with us on Twitter. However you'd like to ask your question, I'm more than happy to answer it. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Erin. That was terrific. Good timing as well. Obviously a lot to cover and a lot to unpack. So I do want to offer a standing invitation. If you want to check in again with this group, consider it another outreach platform and get some ideas and verify some of the work you're doing with relevant community. I lost my chat box, but I did want to mention just before we turn to the next presentation, Colleen mentioned that there's an NSF solicitation on synthesis and data reuse, so bring your proposals. And also as a question about, we can leave the question, Erin, you can think about it and get to it to the end, as a question about how the Arctic Data Center governance connections with other relevant institutions like NOAA's National Center for Environmental Information. So well, we can answer those questions at the end after we get through our next presentation. So you're up, Nancy. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, I guess I can jump right in here. Hi everyone. I think there are a few people in this call who may already know me, but plenty of others who don't. I am a research scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm part of the International Arctic Research Center, IARC, and within that, I'm part of this research group called SNAP, the Scenarios Network for Alaska and Arctic Planning. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about kind of the flip side of data sharing. I'm not a social scientist. I'm a biologist by background. We do struggle here, certainly with some of the issues that were just discussed regarding how to deal sensitively with social science data and so forth. But I'm going to be talking more about the opposite, about how to take non-sensitive data, climate data, biophysical data, some of our very large data sets, and make them more broadly accessible, more applicable, more useful to a wider range of people, wider audiences. Okay, let's see. So just really briefly, this is our homepage. Part of our mission from the very start, and we've been around since 2007 as a research group. Core to our mission has been this idea of sharing information, sharing data, making things publicly available. And it's been great for me as a scientist working in this environment, working with SNAP, because it means I don't have to do that typical academic siloing, holding on to information, sequestering it. It's quite the opposite. And so that's been wonderful scientifically, but it's always been a challenge to have this mission, to have this idea. Yes, we're going to share data, we're going to make it available, we're going to make it open source, usable by anyone. But what does that actually mean? So I've got a lot of screenshots in here from our website. You can take them with a grain of salt because things shift around. Our website's always being updated, and that's actually kind of part of the point. Is that we're always trying to improve things. So you see here some of our analysis tools, and then you see this idea that you can also enter our data portal. And if you do that, if you enter our data portal, you have kind of a traditional interface. These are data sets you can download. They measure in the terabytes. Anyone can access them. But if you are going to be someone who accesses these data sets, you have to be pretty well versed in dealing with, what formats they're in. All the metadata are there. Everything is correct and proper in terms of data sharing. But is data actually what the average user, what most people want? And the answer to that is no. Even among very highly educated, well-versed audiences, dealing with raw data is a headache. It's often where people send emails to me saying, okay, I've gotten into the system and I'm trying to figure out, et cetera, et cetera. They want to talk to a human, or they want something that is packaged to answer the questions they have about landscape level change, about climate change as they're seeing it, as they're experiencing it. They want something visual. They want something that's a little more tailored. And increasingly over the years, I've in my own position, transitioned from being a biologist, which is my background, my academic field, to being a lot more of an interpreter, someone who tries to take data and make it make sense. And so this graphic that I'm pulling up here is one part of that, is talking to people about what data mean in terms of planning, in terms of the questions they actually step forward with. And so one step in that is taking off, or at least adding to my scientist hat. My training is in forecast planning, what you see on the left, the idea that, that if you're creating a model that you're looking at one single future, maybe there's uncertainty, you talk about plus or minus 10%, you talk about p-values and 95% certainty and statistics. But especially working in climate change, what people experience and what people are dealing with is much more of this scenario planning reality, where there are multiple futures that are channeled through a lens of uncertainties, and where if you're actually trying to apply climate data and climate information to that future, you have these choices, which you see on the right there: robust, bet the farm, hedge your bets, core, satellite, where instead of saying, okay, tell me what the future is, like an oracle, you're saying, what are the possibilities? And then based on those possibilities, how do you allocate your limited resources? How do you think about planning? So I'm putting this out there as kind of the framework within which we work when we're talking about how to look at data and how to share data. So it's a very different mode of thinking when we're talking about creating tools. And that brings us to with whom are we working? What is the point of trying to share data? And how are we thinking about effective data sharing? So I have a few examples here showing the wide range of information sharing that we're trying to address. So this is a slide that I pulled from this really great adaptation process that I got to be part of this winter, right before we stopped actually getting to meet with humans in person. So I was really lucky to get to be part of this process. And this was a planning process where community members from a number of different villages, small communities in western coastal Alaska came together to talk through how climate change is affecting their communities, what they're seeing on the ground, and how data from the university, from scientists, from people like us, might actually inform their planning, their understanding, their decision-making process. So instead of this being researchers like myself pulling in Indigenous knowledge, it's more the reverse. It's this mostly Indigenous group of people trying to pull in our knowledge into their planning process. So that's one contextual slide. Another one here, a different group, something that's actually kind of being built right now is this community cohort. Again, this is a slide pulled from a presentation, a group that I'm involved in, trying to pull together small communities from around Alaska and larger communities. This is a sort of more mid-level, looking at least for the first iteration at communities that are on the road system, that maybe have some access to data, but are trying to find better ways to tie into the system, to tie into what the science is saying, to learn from one another. So again, trying to figure out how to access the data and apply it to the problems, the issues, the challenges that they see. And then this third example here, this is kind of the highest level. Anchorage is the largest city in Alaska, of course, and they went through a planning process in recent years, creating this climate action plan. It was adopted by the Anchorage Assembly last year, and we here at SNAP got to be part of that process, supplying data, supplying graphs, an example here, one that ended up in the final report. So you have these different levels, these different types of communities, these different types of users. What they have in common is that they're trying to pull in data in a meaningful way to apply to planning processes having to do with climate change. So that brings me to the question of how do we, as a group of researchers, programmers, web designers, but essentially a science-based group, how do we try to meet those needs, address those needs by, yes, having accessible data, which we do, and I showed you already, great data sets, anyone can access them, but what else can we do to make data meaningful, to take raw data and turn it into graphs or charts or tables, graphics, presentations, things that have interpretation attached to them already, that aid in understanding, and that take these processes from the ground level, from a group of people in a room saying, hey, this is what I'm seeing, in the community of St. Michael's or Yagik or wherever they're coming from. that's always the starting point, that, these photos are visualizations of people's challenges, problems, whether it's thermokarst or whether it's, changes in storm patterns. It all comes down to what people are bringing to the table when they're asking for data. So this takes us back to our starting point. Here's our web page. You can click there. It says see the data, and you get into these analysis tools, which are various attempts at being user friendly. And these are works in progress. We are updating them, we're tweaking them, we're asking for feedback on them all the time. So the screenshot that's here might be slightly different from what you see yourself if you go to our website at www.snap.uaf.edu, just because we're actually always processing them. And I'm talking to our team in our team meeting on Tuesday, I said, can you make sure everything's accessible Thursday and Friday, because I'm going to be talking about these tools. We try to have them always online all the time, even as we're updating, because keeping things consistent is crucial. And I'm going to really quickly go through some examples here, not to try to teach everyone here on Zoom today how to use the tools, but just to show some of the challenges we face in trying to create user-friendly tools that still are scientifically rigorous. So for example, one of the tools looks at wildfire, very important, an issue of great concern to real people in communities who are threatened, whether by smoke, by physical danger from fire, by the changes to the landscape that occur with fire. And we have a huge amount of fire data and future fire modeling. Trying to put it all into one model leaves a user with this interface that's kind of a familiar Google Maps type interface. So that's helpful that we can use something that users are already a little familiar with, and then have these choices in the menu. Do you want to look at particular year of fires? Do you want to look at land cover, hotspots? And then there's a way to be walked through this to show, okay, what do these lines and dots and colors actually mean? What, this is a fire perimeter. This is how many active fires, inactive fires. So all these tools have a lot of these pop-ups trying to show people what they're seeing. But you can tell there's still a lot of challenge here. People have to understand that the little I means click for information. They have to understand how to use the menu, all the different choices they have there to see two different maps at the same time, to compare, to contrast. So then we have another tool, and I'm going to run quickly through these examples in the interest of time, but just to give a sense of how many different types of data we're trying to serve up and what some of the challenges are in making that viewable and accessible. So climate projections themselves. This is how do you look at temperature projections? Again, this is a KML, Google Earth type interface. That helps because it's familiar. But there are a lot of choices in here. Are you looking at projected data? Do people know what a GCM is? You have to have a pop-up to explain that. If you're looking at historical data, people probably don't know what the PRISM data set is. You have to have some kind of explanation in there. And you notice across the top of the screen here, you're allowing people all these choices of, you don't want to look at 10-year averages, what decade do you want to look at, what kind of uncertainty are you willing to deal with? And there's always this push and pull of giving people too many choices or too few choices. This tool here, the community charts tool, has been around for a long time, pretty much since our beginning in 2007. It's really popular, I think, because people are able to digest it. It's a simple bar graph. People are able to say, okay, I'm seeing different decades shown in different colors, projected over time, and I'm seeing how temperature is projected to increase over time. So that seems to be something people feel they can access. And one thing that I have found in talking to people, they really like this drop-down menu at the top. You're seeing Allakaket, but any community, not just in Alaska actually, but in a large part of Western Canada as well, you can pull it up, you can see a graph for your own community. And this seems to be really important to people, that they can see the data for where they are. And you can look at precipitation, or you can look at temperature. And circled in red here, I've shown some of the choices that you're offered, which again, it's tricky. Do you want to look in inches or millimeters? Are you looking at historical or projected data? We try to keep the number of choices low because it adds complexity, but at the same time, you need to have those choices in there to fully represent the data that are available. Extreme weather, it's another issue that people are really, really interested in. Obviously, looking at just trends over time, what's the average temperature for a decade? That's not really how people think about weather. What they think about is, are there going to be extremes? Because those extremes tend to be what really hit people. Sudden cold, huge rainstorms, unprecedented snowfall, unprecedented heat. This is one of our tools that, in my opinion, needs some work because it's complicated, because there, as you can see, too many things circled in red. You can choose what time span you're looking at, you can choose what month, you can choose region, and whether you're looking at temperature, whether there are variables in play with wind speed, whether you're looking above a certain threshold or below a certain threshold. And I think this needs work because when I was working, when I was presenting these same tools, not at such rapid speed, with a lot more explanation, I presented these tools to that first audience you saw, that group that we were lucky enough to work with from communities in Western Alaska. First of all, I was very excited to work with that group. People were very engaged. People were really interested in these tools. We went into a computer room at Rasmussen Library on campus here at UAF. Individuals in small groups were sitting in front of computers and were very quickly and automatically and accessibly logging into these different tools, jumping in, playing around with them, using them. It was great for me because it showed me firsthand, as I kind of roved around the room talking to people, it showed me what people were able to really quickly tweak and work with. And these were experienced folks who are like, oh yeah, Google Maps interface, they're on it, they're zooming in, they're zooming out. But it also showed me what kind of tools were daunting, were confusing, had too many choices, too many unfamiliar terms, too many acronyms, too many variables. And the truth is, with any user group, if people are working from afar, if they're at their own desk or in their own community, you're not always going to get the questions back. You're not always going to have people saying, wow, I was completely lost trying to understand what the heck was going on with this graph. It's hard to get that feedback. If you seek feedback from focus groups, you can get it a little more, but that takes time, that takes energy, and it's tricky figuring out who could be in that focus group, who's willing to be giving that kind of feedback. So this was an example of a tool that had people a little lost. This next tool was one people found really interesting and accessible, partly because sea ice was of tremendous interest to that particular group. People from coastal Western Alaska are seeing changes in sea ice, and they were able to talk to me and help me understand and learn more about what that means to them in terms of their lives, their livelihoods, what they've seen over time. This is an example of how we try to, within the tool, inform people by trying to define our terms. This is a screenshot of the tool itself. This is not projected data. You can see these are data from 1850, and this is a fascinating data set because it incorporates traditional knowledge, data from communities themselves, from sea captains who were out trying to navigate these waters. Really interesting data sets went into the creation of this tool. And it's a format that's visual. This is two screenshots put together. You can see that one is from January 1850, one from January 2016. Huge recession in sea ice and in thickness of sea ice over time. You can run this as kind of a live visual, seeing the change as the ice ebbs and flows with months and seasons. Really appealing to people and intuitive. So thinking about what data connect to people's own knowledge, what data connect to what people care about, loss of sea ice, and what is intuitive in terms of how human beings understand data. And then this last tool is another one that proved to be a little more challenging. Again, this particular group of people were very interested in sea ice loss and very interested in the interplay between loss of sea ice and wind, because of course coastal erosion and other damage to communities occurs when you don't have the protective sea ice, when you don't have the sea ice in place during the seasons when it's traditionally been there, and then when storms and wind hit the coast. This tool allows you to choose different regions of Alaska, different months, and then to look at that intersection between over time loss of ice and over time changes in wind. What you're seeing on the graph is the blue, the loss of ice, quite steady in its projections into the future. The wind a lot more variable. It's unclear whether wind is actually increasing or decreasing, or increasing or decreasing in variability. But again, the interface here was a little more confusing, and what the graph was saying was a little more confusing. And then finally, this is a tool that didn't appear in some of the screenshots because it just got added, a tool I worked on myself, looking at how climate change may affect agriculture, gardening, ability to have community gardens. And I threw this in here at kind of the end of my set of examples because this is a project I was the PI for. I put a lot of thought into how do you represent some pretty complex information in ways that is actually useful and usable to people who are considering whether they want to grow anything from a backyard garden to starting a peony farm. As you see at the top of the screen, there are 4 different tools within the tool looking at growing season length, annual minimum temperatures, how cold is it going to get, what are the killing frosts going to be, and this one, growing degree days, which is a concept that's unfamiliar to a lot of people. Probably people in the audience right now are like, I'm not entirely sure what a growing degree day is. I'm not going to belabor the point right now, but it turns out that especially in Alaska, growing degree days are one of the most important variables for what we can and cannot grow. It's essentially the cumulative heat above a threshold. The threshold varies for different plants, but for any given plant, it's not going to grow until the temperature reaches that threshold, and then its growth tends to be determined by the total cumulative heat above that threshold. So you get more points added to your graph if it's not just barely above the cold threshold that you need, but substantially above it. Explaining that in simple terms is difficult, and yet it's very, very important information for thinking not only, as it turns out, not only about gardening, but what vegetation will grow statewide. So trying to think about what people are familiar with, and I threw this in at the end because this is a more familiar, probably everyone has seen on the back of a seed package, this idea of hardiness zones. In my opinion, this is actually much less useful in telling you what you can plant where in the state of Alaska, because it's only based on predicted coldest winter temperature, which is often really not the driving force on whether you should plant tomatoes or peas or neither or both. But it's more familiar. And so I kind of threw it in there as a discussion point for, there's this odd balance between presenting information in formats that's familiar to people and therefore sort of more accessible versus information that might actually be more useful but's unfamiliar and requires a steeper learning curve in order for people to connect it to what they already know. And so that takes us all the way back to kind of where we started, which is what people know, which is really, really crucial, going in both directions. What was talked about in the previous presentation of taking both social science and local knowledge and indigenous knowledge and making that information more available, more accessible in a way that's respectful, that doesn't impinge on people's privacy, doesn't endanger people, obviously. But then in the other direction, starting with what people know, whether that's people in Anchorage working on their climate plan, whether that's people in Igiugig working on their climate plan, starting with what people know, and then trying to connect it in accessible ways to more traditionally scientific data. So I threw a lot into what was a presentation that I was trying to keep within time limits and probably failed on. That brings up a lot of questions. So hopefully we still have a little time to discuss. Thanks.
So thank you, Nancy. And we do have some questions that were in the agenda that we don't have to stick to. In particular, starting to contrast these two presentations. I don't think it was intentional that we weren't trying to make a strong point that these are just two different data services, two different organizations doing good work. And that's the scope of the data, IARPC data collaboration team, as we cover all of this subject matter. And in particular, this month is we're focusing on an external engagement on social science data. So I'd like just to throw, we can answer any questions to either of the presenters. These are just kind of teasers if anybody wants to speak to those. And then I just will reserve a minute at the end for the future topics.
Do we want to start with the phone? I know we have a few called in. Anyone on the phone, reactions to the terrific presentation that just occurred? Yep.
Hello? Yes, I just wanted to say something if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah. I'm here. Bill Fitzhugh, who's on the IARPC committee, he asked me to join in because he had to leave early. But my name is Dr. David Nordlander, and I just wanted to say those were wonderful presentations. And Bill and I and others at Dartmouth and Smithsonian and Harvard are actually also trying to answer some of the questions that came up with how to begin to use more social science collections and data sets held by Dartmouth, Harvard, American Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian, Library of Congress, et cetera, and how to pull those together and make them available through the web to a much wider audience, but also in interdisciplinary fashion, how to connect those to a lot of the other scientific data sets that are out there that historically may blend together in very unique ways. And we're all working together on how to create new search algorithms and other ways to tap in a very large interdisciplinary framework, this social science and scientific data together. And also put it in a scope that will make it more usable and understandable to a wider audience, from a range of historical sources to anthropology, to geology and climate science, et cetera. So I just wanted to say, on behalf of Bill Fitzhugh, I really enjoyed the presentations, and I found them very germane to also what we're trying to do right now, mostly through Dartmouth, Smithsonian, and Harvard, and very eager to keep up on this because I thought both speakers raised some really great questions about how to integrate these kind of data sources and make them available to wider audiences.
Thank you so much. So we'll take that as an action item to make sure you get linked with Erin and Nancy. I think that the bigger topic there is these governance connections and linking these networks, which did come up in the chat box. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Others on the phone? Great. So others in the room, reactions. We have, unfortunately, 5 minutes, but hopefully this is an ongoing conversation we'll continue to have.
Hi, this is Rosemary at Dongarok.
Yes, go ahead, Rosemary.
This is really important information for us in the Arctic, living through some of these important processes. My concerns are that our traditional values have not been incorporated into some of these documents that are assessing decisions on values. We have important data sets that have not been assessed because we're looking at information that was collected, not information that also exists but was not collected. And we have tremendous amount of concern about the way fragmentation of information is being presented. I mentioned how a change in administration in a scenario could really impact tribes in fundings, but yet one of the processes prevented us from looking at that because that wasn't a variable that they were willing to look at in these scenarios. And yet our tribes are facing severe impacts right now and trying to keep our doors open with the changes that we're facing right now and inability to effectively participate and communicate. But it's a fragmentation of information that can be presented in these processes that can be most damaging to us. Our traditional knowledge needs to be incorporated with us engaged in these processes to allow the discussions of the knowledge and not let the knowledge be fragmented and used against us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. I have a reaction, but I'm going to open it up to the terrific minds on this call. Colleen, Nancy, others, you want to react to that comment that Rosemary just submitted?
Rosemary, this is Colleen Strawhacker. I just want to say that I completely agree with you. Thank you for your words on that and for reiterating that point. I think it's incredibly important, and we're always looking for ways to do that and to do it better. So please feel free to give us some more ideas and how we can continue to do that and do it well and do it better.
And this is Jonathan. I think I have to say, at least some of what SNAP is doing is looking at a user-oriented perspective. So they are bringing the synthesis up to a level that might be more relevant to communities. Although the point is well taken, is how do you design these endpoints and these user tools, and where was the community you're speaking to specifically involved in that process?
Thank you, John. And yet also the structure of the interaction itself, we need to think hard about. Did someone have a comment? Nancy?
Oh, yes, I was going to thank Rosemary very much for her comment. It's incredibly important. And yeah, there's a steep learning curve for a lot of people like me who were not trained in, not trained in cultural communication, not trained in the social sciences. And yet it's incredibly important that, we learn an enormous amount about information flow and respectful sharing in both directions. And we are very lucky to have some people who are helping us with that. Melinda Chase, who was the lead on the project I referenced, is a tribal liaison and has taught me a lot personally, but we need more of that. We absolutely need to learn more as we figure out many of the things I was talking about, how to make information accessible and relevant and inclusive and coming from communities of all types and all sizes, rather than being some kind of top down, let's hand out information from the university, because it's inappropriate and not useful to have that old style attitude.
Well, here we are at the top of the hour, and I want to thank everybody for participating. If you could just go to the next slide. Next, we'll have to be continued next month in August. We're going to continue to focus on the social science domain and do introspective analysis of the performance elements from the health and well-being collaboration team, coastal resilience, and I threw in there environmental intelligence to the extent it touches on the social science domain. And this is the schedule for the rest of the year. So I hope that I'll be reaching out to many of you, and you'll come back and continue to participate next month as we continue to explore these ideas. So anything else, Mike?
No, thank you to the speakers. Thank you, Colleen, Nancy, and Erin. Those are terrific. And thanks for everyone who participated. Hopefully this is an ongoing conversation. We'll try to check in as much as we can. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.